All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our weekly discussion on far villages. Welcome essays for new and beginner poets. It's almost a tradition now for either Diane Gettle or myself. When we mention the title of the book, we tend to hold it up so that people can see what we are talking about. My name is Abayomi Animashaun. I'll be your host for this particular event. Diane Gettle, the executive editor at Black Lawrence Press, we've been alternating on emceeing. So tonight, it's my turn. I hope I do a good job. On Tuesday, we talked about the first part of our discussion on the poet's journey. The title itself is there's something about it that's so innocent and so true. What is the poet's journey? And my hope is that we can come back to this question at some point. But on Tuesday, we talked about, among other things, the role teachers play in shaping our perceptions of poetry. And we talked about the pitfalls of envy, jealousy, and the inevitable fact of failure. So today we'll be continuing our discussion on the poet's journey, because that's just what it is. All of this, going to MFA programs, sending out poems, doing a reading, all these things are part of the poet's journey. So this is what it's about. So this is part of the reason why we have a two-part session for this. So we're going to be continuing that discussion today. Our panelists are also contributors to the anthology, Robbie Gamble, Marina Blitshteyn, Amy Miller, and Darby Price. They'll be reading and discussing from their essays, which together address, the comical, the practical, and puzzling aspects of this thing called the poet's journey. In terms of formats, for those of you joining us for the first time, in terms of formats, we'll have all the panelists read/discuss their essays for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for discussions, for a question and answer period. In the meantime, as the panelists are talking, feel free to use the chat box to throw in whatever questions you have, and we'll be sure to share them with the panelists during that question and answer period. With this, I'm going to introduce our first panelist. And our first panelist is Robbie Gamble. And I'm just going to read his bio from the anthology, at the end of the anthology. Robbie Gamble received his MFA in poetry from Lesley University. His poems and essays have appeared in Solstice, Writers Resist, Mass Poetry, Poet Lore, Rhino, and Carve. He works as a nurse practitioner caring for homeless people in Boston, Massachusetts. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you, Abayo. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks so much. And thank you, Abayo. Thank you, Diane. Thank you for putting this wonderful work together. It's an honor, and it's exciting to sort of be in dialogue with so many other poets who are thinking about what it means to go on this journey. And I really like the idea of thinking about it as a journey. So I'm going to read a piece that I wrote originally for Mass Poetry when I had recently finished my MFA program, was starting to send work out in earnest, and discovering how cold and bleak the world of submitting can be, and just how I sort of came to peace with it. Now I'm the associate poetry editor at Solstice, and so I've seen like the other side of the what goes on behind the submittable curtain, and I can understand much more sort of how submitters and editors are always doing this kind of a dance. But this is sort of more sort of what it means to be on the submitting side of the curtain, and how to keep persevering. And so we have 10 minutes, is that correct? So I think I get, the essay's short, I think I can just go through it. This is called Poems as Pilgrims. I recently evolved into one of those increasingly common creatures, the emerging poet. As an emerging poet, I now possess two things: a sheaf of poems that I am deeply invested in, and a desire to share these poems with a wider world. Oh, these poems. They have progressed from little ahas of inspiration into clunky drafts, and then less clunky redrafts, and then redrafts that start to flow. The duller ones have been shoved into desk drawers for weeks or months at a time in order to ferment and find their voice, emerging wiser and ripe with new strategies for presenting themselves authentically on the page. Others have been picked apart and reassembled in workshops or had drastic surgeries performed on them by revered mentors. And some of these have healed and realigned and grown into healthier beings. There comes a point when the survivors feel more or less complete, and my desire emerges to prop them up and send them out for all to see. I've had a number of conversations recently with fellow emerging poets about the submission process, the emotional roller coaster of exposing our precious poems to the whims and judgment of that other lofty species, the editors, in hopes of convincing them to make a prominent place for our pieces in their prestigious journals. We all have stories to share, from the occasional high of an enthusiastic acceptance letter to the all too frequent low of those impersonal form rejections. Some of my friends bear rejection stoically. When a rejection comes in, I just send that packet right out again, they say. Others have been devastated when the poems that they just knew in their gut was a perfect aesthetic fit for the non-pareil quarterly gets bounced back to the inbox in less than a week with a curt, "Sorry, this just isn't for us." I've been submitting in earnest for over the past year, and I've experienced my own broad spectrum of feelings in response to the inevitable stream of rejections. And still, I have this swelling sheaf of work and a desire to share. Kathleen Spivak was a student of Robert Lowell and apparently was present, Forrest Gump-like, for just about every significant Boston literary event in the 1960s and 70s. In her excellent memoir, With Robert Lowell and His Circle, she describes being invited out for coffee one time with Lowell and Anne Sexton and listening in as the two great poets kvetched about the publishing business and the pitfalls of rejection. They both agreed that a 3% acceptance rate was about the best they could expect. 3%? These Pulitzer Prize-winning literary icons were accustomed to the idea that only 3 out of 100 of their submissions would find their way into print. And this was long before the exponential proliferation of MFA programs and online writing workshops and the legions of all of us earnestly emerging poets. I find great consolation in this anecdote. Once, after a discouraging cluster of rejections, they do seem to come in waves. I went for a long walk in the Maine woods to clear my head. I picked my way along an undulating, moss-carpeted trail as sunlight shafted through the gaps in the spruce canopy overhead, and I found that I was happy just to be in motion, detached from time or destination. My thoughts wandered, as they do on long walks, and at some point they came around to my poems and my efforts to find a fixed place for them in the world. I realized that the poems were on a journey too, from conception to revision to the ups and downs of the submission process. What if I thought of them as pilgrims? In many spiritual traditions, people take a period of time out from their ordinary lives to travel somewhere, on foot or by other means, often at great hardship, in order to achieve a deeper understanding of who they are and how they relate to the broader world. There may be a destination involved, say Lourdes or Mecca, but much of the spiritual growth occurs along the way, and even if the journey is hard, there are moments of joy in it. I now imagine preparing my poems as pilgrims by placing a little staff in their hands and a pack of provisions on their back before sending them out into the world with a click of the submittable button. And I know a few of them will find new homes. Many more of them will return to me, a little wiser perhaps bearing a note of encouragement or advice from a kind editor. Some will cycle in and out, traveling long and hard, and eventually I will see that they need a different flourish or some deeper nourishment in order to have the strength to go on. And some will flounder, eventually recognizing that their path is to end in obscurity. And that will be okay, for they journeyed as well as they could. My hope is that all these poems will grow into who they are meant to be while on pilgrimage, and that I might vicariously grow along with them, and perhaps other readers too. Thanks.
Thanks, Robbie. I just love that idea that it's not just the poet who's on a journey, but the poem, this notion of the poem being on a journey too, alongside the poet is an interesting one. Thank you for that essay.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Marina Blitshteyn. Marina, I really hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. And I'll go on and read a short biography from the back of the book. Marina Blitshteyn is the author of Two Hunters, Argo books, published just last year. She holds a BA from the State University of New York, Buffalo, and an MFA from Columbia University. Prior chapbooks include Russian for Lovers, Skills with $signs for the S's, Nothing Personal, and Sheet Music. She worked as an adjunct assistant professor of composition and rhetoric and hybrid forms. Thanks, Marina.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thank you so much for, putting this together. It's nice to feel connected to the world of poets in times like these, however distantly. So I'm going to read just like several paragraphs from the essay that's in this beautiful anthology, and then I'm going to read some poems about the poet's journey. So I think that, maybe add a little touch of the meta into it. So my little essay was called Poetry Has Value. And it's about, the more mysterious parts of how poets are trying to do this. I mean, at least in my case. So these are the first several, and maybe like one non-sequential paragraph from that too. Poetry has value, but I'm reluctant to say how much money that is, as reluctant as I am to admit how much money I spent on reading fees and application fees and just, hey, notice me fees this year. My credit card statement keeps my secrets. On a good month, which is a month I feel pretty good about submitting, it skyrockets to roughly $400. On a bad month, which is a month I don't feel good about the poems or the business or a soup of both, it could be a measly $30. That's how much it costs for a press to consider my manuscript. And actually, I feel like I've seen 35 at this point. So, inflation. In my heart, I know it's a scam. Oh, I'm sorry. That's just a sound from the internet. In my heart, I know it's a scam. Oh my goodness. This is what happens with these Zoom readings. Do you know what I mean? My apologies. Well, it is a scam on par with the housing market, but I'm not business-minded enough to understand how money is manipulated in this country to stay in the few hands who've had it all along. Some barely even get to touch it, but they know they have it, and knowing it is the prize. Or knowing you have it means knowing you can lose it just as quickly, which is the poison. For those for whom money is abstraction, I bet poetry makes intuitive sense. There can exist this art, this form that comes from nothing and amounts to very little still. Money isn't the object here, and many of us working poets or emerging poets believe that. Some say fame or prestige or maybe validation, but that comes and goes even faster than money. It's a faulty fix, a temporary salve on a larger wound of general worthlessness. Because when we write poems, or rather when we can't resist that urge anymore, very few of us write for a normative purpose, to appease an editor, to profile a current or popular event, to sell pharmaceuticals. The closest we come is in the infamous MFA, where poets sit around drinking cheap box wine and feeling like inheritors of the world together. And true story, actually, the box wine that we used to drink in my MFA, we called Jonathan Franzia, which was a fun joke on how much, money I was losing in loans. All this is to say, I'm still resistant to calling poetry writing labor, as resistant as I am to the idea of work in general. Poetry for me has always been the fun part, an escape from capitalist expectations. Even when it's hard, I think at least I'm not working. At least I respond to the needs of something more permanent than the latest gadget or a finicky administration. I still believe in my spirits. They've stayed with me through sickness and health, for richer or poorer, through an MFA in NYC to an adjunct labor battle I witnessed firsthand. That's the work I'm much more comfortable tacking a price tag to and expect to make a living wage of, and demand some benefits with. The rest, I believe, is poetry. So that was just a little bit from the essay about poetry and money, and it's still actually a conundrum that I'm trying to work out for myself, what poetry has to do with money. And actually, really just the other night, we were talking about how much secrecy there is in making this lifestyle work. It's almost like doing poetry is like a lifestyle choice, you know what I mean? And some get it funded through different means, but we don't really talk about that. And then you feel bad, like you're the only one not making it work, you know what I mean? Which is really devastating to the process of being a poet, a writer, and a woman at that. And so I'm gonna read a couple of poems about poetry that are speaking to that for the last several years. After grad school, I felt betrayed by poetry's more mortal conduits, or it wasn't their mortality I scorned, our fickle humanity, our shared grievances over petty things, our oeuvre, fueled by our lust for ourselves. God, what was my problem that silly people can make beautiful work, or that I tried my whole life to be good, but God only moves in me sometimes? Unsent letter to a young poet from 2019. Keep seeking in good faith your art. Student of our deception, little man assuming conventions. Keep at the center of your work, not labor. Poetry on the side, hold on to it. At the margins of public and private life are those good students who listen. Circumstances. I don't have anything eloquent to say, so I write. I don't want to think about this thing, so I write. I got denied unemployment insurance for the summer, so I write. I'm an adjunct in an interminable professional condition, so I write. I'm a failed writer at a dead-end job, so I write. I neither belong to the school I work for nor the students I teach, so I write. Neither does this language belong to me that I write in and teach in, so I write. I scramble for a side hustle during summer break, so I write. I monitor my bank account daily so I don't go over, so I write. So I buy myself presents to make myself feel better about myself, so I write. So I like to pretend I belong in one of the most expensive cities in the US, so I write. So I write to distract myself from the dark void of poverty eating me up. So I write to stare directly into that void and hope that it notices me. So I write to feel noticed by a culture that doesn't care about poets and poetry. So I write to feel my worth in the world despite my current circumstances. So I'm going to end there and just sort of put on the table all the neuroses that go into this thing that I would not have chosen if I had a choice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marina. Oh my gosh, there's so much that your essay and your poems bring up. I'm really hoping that we can get into some of them and try to, one of the words that that's from my MFA years in grad school is like unpack. Unpack. I don't even know how this word came to be, but it's so common, so used. So I'm hoping that we can unpack some of them later on this evening. Our next panelist is Amy Miller. I didn't do a mic check at the start. Can everybody hear me? It's a bit late in the game. Thank you. So Amy Miller's full-length poetry collection, The Trouble with New England Girls, won the Lewis Award from Concrete Wolf Press. And her poetry and essays have appeared in journals ranging from Asimov's science fiction and fine gardening to Gulf Coast, Nimrod, The Poets Market, and ZYZZYVA. She lives in Oregon, where she works as an editor and print production manager.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Abayo, and thank you, Diane, for having me here tonight and for doing this really wonderful anthology that is just so packed with great stories. I haven't even quite made it through every one of them yet. I reach in and keep snacking. It's a great snacking book. So this is the essay in the book is about my first reading as a featured poet, as opposed to, let's say, an open mic or, you know, a cattle call at a conference or something like that. This is something that happened about 20 years ago, this first reading. And after it happened, it was kind of a painful experience, as you will find when I read the essay. I was embarrassed by it, and I was ashamed at how naive I was and the mistakes that I made, you know, really early in the process of being a writer. It makes me laugh now. You know, there's the old adage that that comedy is tragedy plus time. So I've kind of enjoyed, you know, writing it up now as a learning experience. I'm going to mention that I've had social phobia ever since I was a kid. I was a very shy kid, and so readings early on were really, they weren't difficult for me, but they were challenging, definitely. Now, 20 years later, I love to do readings. It doesn't bother me at all. I've come a long way since then. And this essay touches a little bit on the economics of doing out-of-town readings, which dovetails a little bit with what Marina was talking about, those costs that are sort of part of being a writer that they don't talk about too much when you're starting out, right? You learn that as you go. So I'm going to be reading a condensed version of this essay. It's called A State of Blunder, my first reading. My first foray into the world of poetry readings was almost 20 years ago, when I was fairly new to the writing business. I just had 3 poems accepted by a good literary journal in Texas, and then the journal's editor emailed me, asking if I'd like to read at their issue release party in Austin. This seemed like a huge honor, since I lived near San Francisco, 1,700 miles away. I thought, wow, this good journal is actually inviting me all the way to Texas to read. This could be my big break. What I didn't realize, and what I will clue you into now so you can experience the full ridiculousness of this story, was that the editor hadn't just sent this invitation to me, she'd sent it to all of the poets who were published in the new issue, roughly 50 people. Now that I have 20 years more experience, I know this drill. The editor wanted a good crowd at the launch party, so she was casting out a net, hoping a few nearby poets would show up to read. But back then, I did not know this drill. What I did know was that I really, really wanted to do this reading. Flying to Texas to read poetry, it seemed sort of nutty, but I had a good paying job and I had vacation time coming. So I quickly replied to the editor and accepted the invitation. She answered, "How nice that you're willing to come so far. I'm afraid we can't help you with travel expenses." Okay, I thought, this is a poetry gig that doesn't pay. Maybe they're all like that. No matter, I booked my flight and arranged for lodging in Austin. And the editor had said to bring books to sell at the book table. So I got to work assembling 20 copies of a handmade chapbook, my first one ever, which I packed carefully into my suitcase. Do not forget the chapbooks. About a week before I was scheduled to fly out, my manager at work called me into his office with news of a different sort. I was fired. The company I'd worked for 14 years was laying me off. This was in 2001, 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, and thousands of people in the San Francisco area had been laid off. I had no idea how I was going to pay the rent. And there I was, sitting on plane tickets for a harebrained trip to Texas, hundreds of dollars about to drain out of my bank account. And from the emails flying around about the reading, I was starting to realize that the invitation wasn't, in fact, an honor individually aimed at me. 5 other poets would be reading there as well, all from the Austin area. So I was not as special as I thought. And in fact, I'd been sort of a rube to say yes to this. But the plane tickets were already bought. The hotel room was reserved. And in the crap storm that had become my life, I felt like I needed something good, something fun and impractical that made me feel like a writer, not a loser. So I flew to Texas. By the time I arrived in Austin for the reading, I was nervous as hell, my hands actually shaking as I walked in the door of the little bookstore. To my astonishment, the place was packed, all seats taken, people standing 3 deep at the back and sitting in the aisles. I quickly counted heads. There were about 100 people crammed in there. When my turn came to read, I stood up and gave a decent delivery of my handful of poems, only making one gaffe when I lost my place in one of them. And then the reading was over, poof, and everyone stood up and started milling around in a sort of giant cocktail party. And now I was in a situation way more frightening than a reading. Now it was a room full of people who all knew each other, who were gravitating into little clutches of conversation. I stood there alone, trying not to think of all the times I'd stood in a room like that before, while a crippling shyness, a phobia that had plagued me my whole life, tightened around me like a giant hand. No, I was not going to crumble with social phobia this time. I'd flown all this way to star in this show. I needed to just loosen up and be normal like all these other people. I found the makeshift bar and poured myself a plastic cup of wine. Sometimes booze helped. I saw a friendly-looking group and sidled over to them, but they disbanded, leaving me alone again. I sought out the hosts and the other poets, but they were all deep in talk with friends. I studied the artwork on the walls. I tried to look happy and inviting, but slowly I could feel myself falling into a full-on panic attack. I stood there in something approaching physical pain for about another 20 minutes and then gave up. I set down my drink and walked out the door. I got into my rental car and sat in the parking lot for a long time, shaking with frustration. Was I really this messed up? Had I come all this way just to be derailed by a whopping attack of shyness? Maybe if I calmed down, I could go back in, but it was too late. People were streaming out of the store. The party was breaking up. Half relieved, I thought, well, at least I'll go back in there and get my chapbooks from the book table. But then I realized that in my nervousness, I'd forgotten about the chapbooks. They were still in the trunk of the car. I was officially a loser. I drove back to the hotel, the saddest sad sack in all of Texas. After I flew home, I left the chapbooks in the suitcase for about a month, unable to look at them. But honestly, in spite of all that, this is a happy memory. Yes, ruefully happy, but now it makes me laugh. This experience taught me a lot of things. First, really don't forget the books. And even though that was one of my all-time worst attacks of social phobia, I did survive it. But the main thing I learned was that it's good to just show up. Yes, it was crazy to fly all that way to do that reading. And yes, I've done a few other readings since then that probably didn't justify the travel costs. But readings are unpredictable. Even at the tiniest ones, you often meet great people in the audience. Sometimes you meet authors who hook you up with other readings or publishers. It's all a crapshoot, the chaotic mathematics of personal encounters. But you keep coming back to the common denominator. You standing up in front of people and reading your work because someone invited you to do it. It is actually a little bit of a dream and a story you can tell your friends for years to come, and a notch in your resume that says, yeah, I did that nutty thing because I'm a writer and that's what we do. Thanks. You're hearing from Buckley. He's right here. He's a Zoom star.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much for that wonderful, honest essay. Oh my word. Oh my word. Wow. 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 Can you imagine? I can't even begin to have to take the time to pack all those books and then get them in the car. Oh my word. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Darby Price. And I'll go in and read her bio. Darby Price earned her MFA from George Mason University, where she was a Heritage Fellow and the poetry editor for Phoebe. In 2014, she was named a finalist for the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing Fellowships and a semifinalist for the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center Fellowships. Darby is now a lecturer at UC Irvine and a volunteer for Right Girl Los Angeles. Her interviews and book reviews have appeared in The Collagist and the Southeast Review, and her poetry has appeared in Zocalo Public Square, Beloit Poetry Journal, Cimarron Review, Redivider, Sierra Nevada Review, and PANK. Is that how you say it? P-A-N-K? Among others. Thanks, Darby.
Thanks so much, Abayo. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Abayo and Diane for putting this anthology together. I couldn't agree more with Amy that this is a wonderful snacking book. I keep dropping into it and just picking an essay at random and being absolutely delighted. So I'm so grateful that this exists and that I get to be a part of it. And I have so much admiration for the poets and the pieces that I'm sharing this reading with. So thank you for giving me this space. I'm going to read from my essay, and it is called A Michael Bay Brain, Encouraging Words for the Working Poet. I'm going to skip around it a little bit because it's a little long, but a few things you should know. When I say a Michael Bay brain, I am referring to probably an anxiety disorder. Just this thing that happens where my imagination gets very like intense and visceral and physical. And so the essay starts with a memory of being in grad school, and I'm working at an Irish pub when I'm not supposed to be working at an Irish pub because the TA contract said we're not supposed to have another job, but you know, try living on 13 grand a year in Washington, DC. So I had a job. And so the essay starts with this memory of, you know, I'm super busy and I'm at the pub and I hear what I think is a gunshot. And it is not. It is somebody kicking the door open super hard, so it slams against the wall. So I stood there, elbows propped on the counter next to the soda dispenser, thinking about what would happen if an argument really did turn violent in that space. My first thought was that I'd be in deep trouble financially. I was dependent on tips for my livelihood. What if the restaurant turned into a crime scene and I couldn't work for weeks? I'd be skating on very thin ice in terms of my ability to pay rent and buy groceries. My next thought was even more grim. What if I'd been standing on the other side of the room, rolling silverware or something, and that had been a gunshot? What if I had been shot through the door? My reaction to this question was both very surprising and very telling. I didn't think about pain, death, or the inconvenience of being hobbled by a gunshot wound. I thought again about the money. It occurred to me that, although I wouldn't be able to work, I would be entitled to workers' comp and or some pain and suffering money. The vision again ballooned, and I found myself daydreaming about getting shot in the leg. A clean wound through the meat of the thigh, maybe, away from major arteries and bone, and being free from the burden of outside work for the rest of my grad school days. The daydream became a fantasy, an elated sort of realization that I would never have to work in the service industry again. This was, of course, a completely insane thought. I knew it even as I mulled it over. And as with all of my best insane thoughts, I wrote it down. I started scribbling notes and images on my server's order pad, flipping the small pages breathlessly as I filled them with the lush, specialized language of side work. Marrying ketchup, ramekins, the expo. As I wrote, I returned to my first thought, the larger impact of restaurant as crime scene, and I thought about the elderly couple who came in every Friday night and sat near the band, and how disappointed they'd be if their evergreen date night establishment was shuttered. I jotted that down too. I got so engrossed in the scene in my head, from the yellow caution tape to the blood all over the highly polished steel of the expo, where plates are passed from chef to server, a clear desecration of all that American culture holds dear in food safety, that I didn't clock out right away when I finally could. I stayed for 10, 15, 20 minutes longer, writing and writing, and nobody bothered me. Those scribbled notes torn out of a server's order pad became a long prose poem that was eventually accepted for publication by Cimarron Review, the first major publication I had to my name. I was incredibly proud of this, of course, and I still am. But it isn't just the poem itself, which I like to think captures something of the sheer desperation of my entire generation, which has become the overworked bedrock of the so-called gig economy. It's also about the circumstances surrounding that publication. I was severely overworked that whole academic year, but particularly that semester. I felt that I barely had time for writing poetry, which was the whole reason that I'd moved clear across the country and left behind a life that I'd built in California. I was going to a therapist on campus once a week to help me process being so overwhelmed. And between that, my classes, my job, and the writing I had to do for workshop, the only time that I really got to relax was between the hours of 11 p.m. and 12 a.m. when I let myself sit down with a glass of wine and watch The Daily Show. It was a rough time emotionally, financially, and spiritually. I found myself in crisis. What am I doing? I asked myself often. Am I even accomplishing anything? I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Things got a little better in grad school, I'll tell you that, a little. My point is this: all beginning poets have lives around them already, and if you're reading this, you're no exception. You might be considering grad school, or you might be in high school wondering how to get started in this world. You might have a young family already, or you might be retiring, or you might be single and awed by your own possibility. But whatever your situation, you are almost certainly dreaming of having more space and more time to write. This is the constant ephemeral goal of the poet: the residency, the scholarship, the children at grandma's for the weekend. Whatever our version of space and time looks like, we all wish for more of it. Wherever we are on the journey, life continues to press in on all sides, and the only thing that we can do is take advantage of opportunities when we have them and carve out space for ourselves when we don't. Because let's be real, the image of a poet sitting in a quiet, light-filled study may be one that looks out on the pepper garden or on the dark edge of a beckoning forest and hammering away at a trusty underwood while a Cuban cigar wafts fragrant smoke from its forgotten place in the ashtray is, to put it mildly, bullshit. It's the image primarily of white male academic poethood, and it does not even reflect the reality of most white male poets. Wallace Stevens, a giant of American poetry, worked for most of his life as an insurance executive. Donald Hall spent years as a sports reporter covering baseball in particular. He even appears in No, a documentary about the extraordinary Doc Ellis. Philip Levine famously spent some of his most formative years in automobile factories. There are as many of these stories as there are poets in the world. And though each life is different and shaped by different forces, the commonality remains. For almost all of us, poetry will not be our only trade. And even if it were, the rest of the world would continue to demand something from us. In other words, we all have to fight to create space for poetry at every step of the way. The fight can look different at different stages. So no matter how little you think you're giving to your art, please believe me when I say that it is still a gift you are giving yourself. and it is still worthwhile. Skipping ahead again. Now, though the academic life continues to be an unpredictable ride, when I first wrote this essay, I celebrated the fact that I was employed full-time at just one university. Since then, that one university cut a whole roster of its full-time lecturers, and I spent my summer scrambling to find another part-time teaching position. And update, like I'm now back to just working at one university, so who the hell knows? It's all upside down. Things are better in many ways, and I'm filled with gratitude for that. I've had poems published in well-regarded journals, and one of those journals has been kind enough to publish me twice. I've made wonderful friends in the poetry world, and I have a supportive, vibrant community of writers around me. In that gauzy cocoon of time that was my just one job period, I completed a manuscript of prose poems of which I'm incredibly proud. I feel more stable in my purpose now than ever, even if it hasn't been easy. It took several hours of journaling one recent night to remind me that no, I didn't want to suddenly scrap everything and become a corporate darling just to get the bills paid. My time, my efforts, and yes, my money, you may have noticed that submission fees are de rigueur these days, are precious resources, and the wisest investment of those resources, for me at least, is in the craft of writing. And the thing I've had to realize is that no matter what else I feel that I haven't yet accomplished, my persistence has already paid off. Even when the writing didn't go well, or it was only once a week or so, I did write during even the leanest years. When I wasn't writing, I was sending older work out. So the work continued in one fashion or another, and like the tortoise lumbering down the raceway, I kept pushing forward at my own pace, obstinate in my conviction that if I didn't win, I'd at least reach some kind of finish line. All of that is to say that we can only live the lives that we have in front of us, and there are days when we have to choose between writing a poem and having clean underwear, or writing a poem and feeding the kids, or writing a poem and caring for our aging parents. Poetry is work, real work, and as such, it requires a place where focus and discipline can happen. That's why, to Marina's point, there are so many prizes dedicated to giving poets time, space, and the financial resources to keep their lives together while they dedicate their energies to writing. If you don't have those resources, you might not have easy access to space and time, and that doesn't make you a bad poet. It doesn't mean you will never have the space you want, nor that you failed in some way to achieve true poetness. It just means that your life is ongoing and dynamic, and that you and we are struggling to find the balance. No matter how tiny, unsatisfying, or spare your writing time and space might feel then, keep creating it wherever and however you can. Keep faith with yourself. Deny the voices in your head that would tell you you're being selfish or frivolous for taking half an hour for yourself. Read others' work with a pencil in hand. Don't feel inauthentic if you don't have a sexy moleskin. Jot lines on a crumpled up receipt, a paper plate, a server's order pad. Assemble your ideas on the page. Send it out when it's ready, even if you're not. Grow a thick skin for rejection. Unless you got drunk and socked the editor at a party, it's almost certainly not personal. And even as you try to share your work with the world, know that publication is not the best measure for success, even though we all want our words to be read by another. And it is true that being published never ever gets old, if you're anything like me. When I finally do get a book published, I imagine my head will explode. Rather, your growing skills, your sharpening sense of rhythm and sound play, your feel for a good line break, the aha moments when you finally find exactly the right word to show the reader what the world looks like through your weird, warped Michael Bay brain eyes. These are the small joys and triumphs that will propel you forward and make you feel more fortified. These are the moments that will keep you coming back to that sacred space in your office chair, at the dining table, on the bus, or next to the soda machine in the kitchen of an old Irish pub. Thank you so much.
I love that ending. I love that ending so much. Oh, what a wonderful essay. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You can't even begin to know how 9 times out of 10, I feel like I haven't done anything with my life. So that essay, oh my word, that wonderful essay. Thank you for that essay. Thank you for that perspective. All right. Thank you, all panelists. Now we're in the question and answer session. I'm hoping that our audience members would join us. So again, if you have questions, please just drop them in the chat box, and we'll include them in the conversation. As people are mulling over what to ask our panelists, I was doing the same today. Normally I would have specific questions to ask each panelist, and we would have a conversation going. But I kept thinking about the beginner's mind throughout today. You know, the anthology is designed for, but not exclusive to, new and beginner poets, as it says in the title. And I couldn't help but think about one of my favorite movies on poetry, Il Postino from the 90s, where the young postman, who is just kind of all over the place with his life, falls in love with his grand poet, Pablo Neruda, the young man played by Massimo Troisi, and the poet played by Philippe Noiret. And at some point, the young man asks the silliest of questions and the best of questions. He asks the grand poet, so how does somebody become a poet? And I would like to become a poet, he says. And the grand poet, and Pablo Neruda says, no, you don't, no, all poets are fats. You stick to what you do, you get exercise or something along those lines. But the young man persisted. But how? How does somebody become a poet? And after the Neruda character stared at him for a while, he says something along the lines of, walk along the shore as far as the sea, or something along those lines. And the man asked, will these things come to me, the metaphors that they've been talking about? And the Neruda character says, yes, they'll come to you. Of course, that's not the only way that metaphors come to us, but at least it's a start. The question I have for our panelists is this, again, going to the beginner's mind. Somebody who's somewhere is just thinking about this thing, poetry. Can I become a poet? Is it for me? How do I start? Where do I go? How does that person become a poet? And I'll mute myself.
Well, that's a great stumper. I knew you were going to ask us a stumper, one that I was completely unprepared for. However, I was thinking last night. Occasionally people will say, how do poems come to you? Which is a very difficult question too. I find that really hard to answer. But I don't know that it's helpful for beginning poets. But for me, poetry is very much a compulsion. And it's like a habit that gets reinforced because I get rewarded for it. But if it's not a compulsion, I don't think that I would do it. And I was really thinking about, why do I do this? Is it for, fame, success? It's certainly not for money. We all know that. Am I trying to explain something to myself? And really none of those is the answer as far as I'm concerned. It is literally a compulsion that the lines just come into my head, probably because I read a lot of poetry early on. And so that was my gateway into it. And it's sort of something that I absolutely have to do. And I would do it regardless of whether people read my work or not. So I feel like if you don't have the compulsion to do it, it's probably a really hard road. So I'll just throw that out there.
I'll piggyback off of that. I do think you have to enjoy it. So if you're an artist of any kind, I imagine that if you're drawn to visual mediums, you might find yourself writing stage plays, or you might find yourself writing films, screenplays. For poetry, I think I realized I was well suited to it when I realized that for me, it takes me a very long time, usually, to process imagery and to process experience and what I think about all of it. And it's not like essay writing where maybe it happens, or, I'm thinking of like op-eds, things that get published like right as something is current events and is really on everybody's mind. For me, poetry is a way to put a lens to things that maybe happened yesterday or maybe happened 8 years ago. So I think in some way, the answer has to do with how does your mind work? And if you're drawn to steeping yourself in imagery via language, then maybe poetry is absolutely for you. But if you like visual imagery, maybe go to film school.
I can piggyback on top of that too. I think we're sort of stacking all kinds of things up. I mean, I came to poetry kind of later in life. I didn't really start writing in earnest until I was in my 40s. I'd written a bunch of horrible dreck in high school and realized I had nothing to say, and so I shut up for a long time until I realized that I wanted to start. I had this urge to process the world through words again. But what I realized in the last few years, every time I sort of have this sensation, like I love words. I'm literally sort of falling in love with words and language and the process of putting them together. And when this doesn't happen all the time, but when that sort of sense of being enamored is flowing, it's just a wonderful process to be able to sit and build things and images, as Darby says, and pull all these things together and through poetry, and then to be able to share it with the community. But it is this sense of kind of falling in love with something and doing it over and over again, and then working at it and applying craft and all those things. But sort of being astonished now and then. It's like, ooh, they did that sort of tingly thing that and that makes it all kind of wonderful.
I have a question, if I may jump in with one. It's this sort of very real and unromantic aspect of the poet's journey, but it came up again and again in what everyone was mentioning, which is how financially challenging it is to be a poet. And I'm wondering, for those of you who teach and or mentor, is that something that you warn your charges about, or do you try to offer some guidance in how to manage it? Because I can only imagine, as being a very young poet, opening up a copy of Poets and Writers or going to the New Pages website and seeing this slew of competitions and calls for entries, and everything just has a $sign next to it. Do you offer any advice about that aspect of the business? Go ahead, after you.
I wasn't sure if anybody else taught, so please, Marina, after you.
I've been teaching for a really long time, and when I got into grad school, the woman who met with me, Lucy Brock-Broido, who has since passed, sat me down in her office, and she was like, look, I can't in good conscience tell you to do this with all the loans that you'll be taking on. And I was young and naive enough to not care about that, though the words still kind of rang in my head and do to this day. And I think it's a real thing. I mean, look, in a world or in a country that valued the kind of awe that Robbie was talking about, everyone would have the opportunity to experience that, to go to school for it, to be a poet, to have the chance to commune with other poets. It shouldn't be a thing that, you take out loans for. And I think it's a real concern. So if I have a student that I work with who's interested in MFAs, I pretty much tell her to do the ones that are free, you know, or the ones that like give you money to do it, which I think should happen. I mean, I kind of expect that of a government, to be honest with you. And there was a time even in the US where that was a thing, you know, in the 60s when it was culturally advantageous. Artists got funding, artists got grants, publishers were more of a thing. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more. And for my female students actually who want to go into publishing, I think it's worth knowing that it's hard to be out there as a young woman, to have your name out there. And that's a conversation that I actually have frankly with them, because I don't want them to just be kind of out with the wolves and then not know that there can be a backlash. It's not always romantic, which is a real shame, and definitely something that I think if we talked more about, we could change culturally and socially and politically.
That's a really good point, Marina. And I think that I teach undergraduate writing. So I'm a lecturer in composition. So I don't work as much with students who are interested in creative writing, although every now and then it does happen, or every now and then I convert one who thinks they're going to be a bio major and then they're an English major by the time they're through with my class, which I love. But in my experience, so my husband and I went to graduate school in Virginia, and we ended up moving back to California after graduate school because the adjunct labor market is so demoralizing and cruel on the East Coast, and in any state that's a right to work state. So this is part of the conversation that I have had with my students who are interested in graduate school, whatever the field is. If they're interested in being a professor, I encourage them to look into, you know, well, where are you going to go to school? As Marina said, the best advice I ever got, if you're going to go get an MFA, make sure it's funded. But, you know, is the university system unionized? Do the lecturers and adjuncts have protections? And it shouldn't be the way that it is, you know, it just shouldn't. And it feels bad to be a part of this system sometimes, but at the same time, I do love what I do. And if a student is really passionate, they really want to teach, and they really want to teach at the higher education level, I'm like, great, let's talk. Let's talk about the reality. Let's make sure you're prepared for what that might actually mean. I mean, a big part of my essay that I didn't actually read is, like, for 2 or 3 years when I moved back to California, I was working at multiple campuses. And because California is all about their freeways, we call it a freeway flyer when you have to drive from one campus to the next in one day. So I would like be eating a sandwich with one hand while I'm driving down the freeway to go to my next job. And that was really hard, you know? And so I think the best thing that we can do is be transparent. And give them the information. And Marina, I was just like you know, I was like, that's cool, I'll make it work. And, you know, I'm very grateful to be where I'm at right now. But it doesn't mean it wasn't hard and that it didn't require sacrifices. So I'm really grateful that we can have this conversation. And, you know, I think all we can do is be transparent. I'm still writing poetry, so that's nice. I mean, it's true also that the teaching schedule just is great. if you get it like just right in that exact right situation, the teaching schedule does allow more time for writing if you can get it. So
I have a follow-up question to that. And it's, so many poets are going to, they'll keep, if a poet is passionate enough, there's nothing you're going to do to stop them from submitting their work with the last dollar they have, right? They're going to maintain that hope that maybe this is the one. But the reality will set in that maybe that's not the one. it doesn't get accepted anywhere, right? And they're pouring in money, and then they're looking around and they're seeing their friends, maybe, because we talked about envy the last time, that there's people they know, hey, this person has won this, that person has won that, manuscript accepted, and all these things. For those people who really want to be part of this journey, who do not have those kinds of acknowledgments, how do they maintain whatever inner drive they have? How do they continue on this journey?
I've run into this with some people. I wouldn't say students. I haven't ever taught, but I do deal with a lot of community members. You know, I live in a small town, and a lot of people email me and ask me things like that. You know, how can I get this book published or whatever? You know, how do I keep going? And you know, I always tell them, you're the only one who can do it. Nobody's going to do it for you. That's what keeps me going. The world is not going to come knock on your door and say, hey, do you have a book of poetry for us? You have to get your work out there. And if this one isn't working right now, then you have to love it, and you have to keep writing and write another one and another one and another one. And they may all be great. And just because they're not getting picked up doesn't mean that they're not great. It's a very crapshoot world, poetry. There's a lot of luck involved. There's a lot of who you know. There's a lot of where you've already been and little contacts that you made along the way. But there really is a whole lot of luck involved. It's that judge that day who is judging that year that you might not even know. There's so many factors to it. But it's, you know, you never stop kind of pushing that rock up the hill. You may feel at some point like, oh, you know, okay, finally it's got some momentum going, right? I can kind of relax a little bit. I've been doing this for like steadily getting work published for about 20 years now. And you never stop pushing that rock up the hill. It's like you're the only one pushing it. And if you don't push it, it rolls backward. You know, it stops. So that's not very inspiring, but it's the truth, I think.
I would agree that there is stubbornness involved. You have to be like relentless. And I think you have to keep this kind of corner of your heart for yourself, you know, like just keep a space where you have faith. And even if you don't have faith, you're at least like, well, I like this though. I'm enjoying doing it. The submitting and the rejections and the waiting around for the answers, whether it's a rejection or not, that all can get very difficult. But I think, I think the Sisyphusian metaphor is very good, but it also like, hopefully you're enjoying the process. Hopefully you can find some joy in that. You know, I think it was Robbie was describing falling in love with language again, and the surprise of what language can do and what it can communicate that maybe other mediums can't. And I love that. And I think that's just spare a corner of your heart for that, so it doesn't all get jaded by the rest of it.
You know, I think also having a community helps, like having just like one friend at least, you know, who like can be with you in the struggle. And that's something that I had to also kind of buy my way into in grad school. I mean, honestly, it was worth every lone dollar that I'll have for the rest of my life, because I made these poetry relationships. And you know, that has really made all the difference. And you know, my like that friend that I made that I think is going to be a lifelong poetry friend, we talk about like, was the MFA worth it? Like, did we waste our money? Did we waste our lives? Whatever. But she was like, you know, how many writers out there feel alone or feel alienated and just disconnected? And she's like, the internet helps, and MFAs, for all their faults, help, and they build that network. And I think that's been such a lifeline for me. Like at the end of the day, like it's actually about people. It's actually like about like finding the people who know how to read your work and like who are excited by it and are also, you know, that you can inspire and that inspire you. So I think it helps having just like a friend in arms about that.
Yeah, I would second what Marina is saying about, I think community is a really fundamental part of things. Yeah, I think when I started writing in earnest, I was doing it kind of in a vacuum. And the MFA experience certainly helped. I mean, I really developed a wonderful community of people within, you know, that I got to know in the MFA process. And then also just people in the community that I've met through readings and, you know, all kinds of communications over time. But I think sort of making good poetry karma too, like sort of celebrating other people's successes and you know, when, you know, sort of promoting other people's work too. When you see a poem that inspires you, kind of pushing, hey, have you seen this piece that so and so did? I think is a really big important part of things. Sort of just trying to help you know, us all lift each other up. I mean, rather than sort of trying to be the one that's you know, sort of, you're fighting to get, you know, the attention of the celebrity poet over, you know, everybody else. That was the thing. I was when I went into the MFA program, I was sort of expecting to be this sort of backstabbing experience where everybody was like sort of trying. It was a zero-sum game, and somebody, you know, there would be winners and losers, and it was a tremendously supportive community. We all took great joy, and people were at different levels of talent, and but we all. I was so moved, but we all, there was sort of this ethos of we all, you know, help each other do our best work and celebrate that, and I've sort of really tried to continue that in the larger community. That sense of like, you know, we're all, none of us are in it, you know, for tremendous fortune, and maybe there's a little bit of fame, but we do it because we love this. We have this relationship with language that kind of keeps us going back to it. As Amy said, this compulsion to put things on the page. So, you know, and it's much better when, you know, we're in relationship and not just on our own, I find.
Right. Thank you all for saying that. I mean, it doesn't have to be this kind of solitary enterprise that's mired in suffering, right? You know, reading other people's work. So we're talking about the poet's journey, reading other people's work, talking about their work, writing reviews of other people's work, paying attention to the community. And Darby Price has a question about community that we're going to ask in a minute. Seeing how you can be of help in that community. These are all soul growth exercises, and that term is not mine. I'm just borrowing it from Coleman Barks. But these are all soul growth exercises that allow us to keep our feet in the water, even though, you know, maybe we're not getting published or we're not winning those awards or whatever. But the fact is that we're growing as individuals, we're growing as poets, and we're learning the community and seeing what the community needs, right? It's not just about us, it's about the people around us as well, right? I really love the idea of celebrating other people's successes, because like I said earlier, it's not just about this one person in his room with his window closed and all these things, which Darby Price adequately calls bullshit, right? Okay, here's Darby Price's question. What advice do you all have for finding community for folks who can't or don't want to get an MFA?
Well, I'd love to answer that. Not having an MFA and living in a town where a lot of people don't have them. I'm in kind of a remote part of Oregon. And, you know, one of the, there are usually state poetry organizations. We have the Oregon Poetry Association here. I think they vary wildly, probably from state to state. Some of them are you know, pretty small, very casual kind of organizations, but they can have great little conferences. Sometimes their conferences can be really wonderful. Even if all the workshops like aren't super high powered or whatever, it's about the people that you meet. Again, getting back to community. that's been the greatest thing about writers conferences for me, is the people that I meet, like sitting and having a lunch, like the person sitting next to me. I made a lot of friends that way. I also tell people to go to readings. You got a bookstore somewhere nearby, probably, and go there as much as you can to see not just poets but all kinds of writers. And I've met lots of people in the audience at bookstores who have become friends and who are also writers. That's where writers hang out. And of course the old one, which is start a poetry group. Put an ad in the paper or put one on Craigslist or something like that, and get if it's not a workshop group, then maybe a support group or something where you're reading books together. It could be a poetry reading book group. Sometimes you have to kind of step out and make a group.
Yeah, for sure. I want to echo that. And I want to also maybe shout out the work that's going on in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. The Just Buffalo Literary Center always puts on like rock star events, and they have workshops for kids in the community and from all over Buffalo. I mean, Buffalo is huge, believe it or not. And, they're bringing people together, and they have great workshops. They have reading series, and also now, when we can't like physically go to a bookstore or like physically go to a space, I think so much more is accessible, and I don't know, I like wonder the extent to which that makes community off of the Zoom space, but I think a lot more is widely available so that you don't have to go to New York City. Do you know what I mean? Like you shouldn't have to like try to live in one of these really expensive cities to have access to writers who are doing the kind of work that you want to be doing. So I think there are a lot of like really great local organizations. And also, I mean, part of my like political platform, I guess, is that I think a lot of that should be funded. And I hope that there are more grants available for that stuff. And I think it's just like really important to move those possible community centers away from MFA programs. Like I kind of, I think it would be better for poetry writ large if that could be the case.
I know I asked the question, so I'm really sorry, but it occurred to me also, my bio says I volunteer for an organization called Right Girl Los Angeles, and I would give that advice to anybody who like knows they're a writer, they're writing all the time, but they just don't know where to find a community. I would tell them, look for volunteer organizations that work in literacy, education, uplifting youth. I have met some of my greatest poetry friends actually through volunteering with Right Girl LA. Because they host monthly creative writing workshops. And so being able to like get to know the other volunteers through doing that has helped me build a community also outside of the MFA. So that's another way of thinking about it too, I think.
Dan, did you want to say something about the post that you just put in the chat box?
Yes, since we're coming, near to the close of our evening together, I just posted two things in the chat box. One is a link in case you are interested in purchasing a copy of Bar Villages, which we've been reading from tonight and hearing from tonight. And there's also a code for if you purchase it through our website, 25% off. And also we are going to have another event on Tuesday with Megan Merchant, David Maduli, Dwayne Herman, Claudia Savage, and John Guzlowski, who are going to discuss reclaiming artistic space. And I think that's going to be a really exciting conversation because, of course, all of these essays were written, far before COVID struck. But reclaiming artistic space is such an important topic right now when we're all stuck inside, maybe sharing space with people that we didn't share space with before or as regularly. I'm just going to say it's a miracle that my 2-year-old hasn't made a cameo yet, so I know all about that. And so I think I've just recently reread the essays that we're going to be talking about on Tuesday, and there's a lot of resonance and there's a lot of wisdom to what's happening right now. So we'd be delighted if you would join us then. So the second little chat that I dropped down there includes the link if you would like to register for the Tuesday event.
So I have a final question before we leave. So I opened with the question, how does somebody become a poet? And the answers I got were read a lot of poetry, try to enjoy it, fall in love with words. These are some of the things that people said. So reading widely is, maybe even wildly, is part of the equation if somebody wants to take this on and make it a lifelong enterprise, if you will. But my question is this: you will not always find, you will not always enjoy all the poets you read, right? And in MFA programs and communities and teachers will ask you to read certain people, and you're just thinking to yourself, oh my God, I don't want to read this person doesn't speak to me, and all these things. So if reading widely is part of the equation, is there any wisdom to reading people who don't necessarily speak to us? How might that help us on our journey as poets? Sorry, everyone.
All right, I'll go first. Oh no, Robbie, you go, please. I've talked so much. Go.
Well, okay. I'll just, yeah, I guess sometimes I'm sort of still trying to formulate. I think there's something to be said for, I guess, sort of being stretched. I mean, and I mean, particularly if I'm introduced, somebody says, "Oh, you should read so and so," and they have a particular interest. Or, I don't know. Say it's Ezra Pound. I mean, this is a really bad example, but they really see something in that. And I remember I had this one teacher who was really able to walk me through a John Ashbery poem, which I'd found utterly impenetrable before, and wouldn't have given the time of day. It just it just didn't relate to me at all. But he was able to take me through it, and I was able to gain something from it in a way that I wouldn't have before. So I mean, I think there is something to sort of to making an effort, or either that or being helped through work that was either difficult or unattractive or impenetrable, and then finding something. And it may not resonate with the kind of work that I do, but who knows? Maybe I can gain something from it. I mean, so I think it's good to have an open, or to learn about a perspective that I might not have had, a voice that is entirely different from my own. I'm struck by sort of the diversity of voices that are gaining more space in the literary world. They're older white males like myself are getting pushed a little bit more to the margins, and there are more people, more diverse people who are claiming a lot of space, and I think that's a really good thing. And I think part of my reading is sort of a lot of times is sort of being shutting up and listening and hearing what other people have to say, and being stretched and challenged in ways that I might not challenge myself because of my own sort of limited perspective. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's sort of where I'm.
Thanks, Robbie. I think with that, we may be coming to it. Darby, did you want to jump in? No? I think with that, we're going to wrap up the evening. Thank you all for coming. Great discussion. And as Diane said, we're going to keep this conversation going on Tuesday. And I can't even wait to see what people are going to talk about in the realities that we're dealing with today. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.